I know we were talking the other night about another way of defining well-being. You were saying by looking at all the things you would need if there was a war, or I guess in this case, a pandemic, and during peacetime or during a time when you don't have a crisis, building up everything you would need to sustain your country when there is. So I guess that would give us stuff like public health care. Um, I think pensions was one. Pensions was one that you said was a sort of a funny topic, and I was wondering why was pension so funny.
Okay, well, first let's talk about why we pay taxes. We pay taxes to preserve our way of life. That means defense. It means someone has to protect why we like crab and calulu. It might not be something very important, but for all those people who like crab and calulu, there are many grandmas who want their grandchildren to keep on eating crab and calulu. And roti, the way you buy it out of, after carnival, the way it's wrapped, the way it's cooked, it's not the same as in India. It's a typical Trinidadian food. So when you're going to do something like that, you have to preserve that. You have to preserve calypso. You have to preserve a brass band. You have to preserve all those things that identify your culture. And that means preserving them against a pandemic or preserving them against a military invasion to kill you all. So that's why you pay taxes, and that's why you mentioned the cycle of war and peace, because you want to have a short war and a long extended peace. And peace and war are tied in that cycle the way light and darkness are tied. The only way you can appreciate light is if there's darkness. So the only way you can appreciate peace is if you've gone or known war. And you want short cycles of war and in peace and long periods or long cycles of peace. And in those peace times, you should build yourself for those defenses. Defenses in medicine, defenses in healthcare, defenses in providing the culture so that one cultural concept is passed on to the other generation. That's what you want to preserve. So there's where you have sort of all these programs that you do in peacetime to be prepared for those crises times. Now let's talk about pensions. Why is pension a funny thing? Well, it turns out that pensions were an idea that were invented by the Germans in the First Reich, not the Third, the First Reich, which is the 1890s around there. But the Germans at the time didn't have money to actually finance these things, so the Americans copied it, and they were the first who invented pensions. The curious thing about it is that at that time, you could pension yourself at 55 when life expectancy, on average, was 50 years. So it was conceived for, on average, for dead people. Now, mind you, on average, when I mean for you to have an average of 50 years of lifespan, it means that some people lived until they were 60 and some people died when they were 40, so that the average could hit 50. But then when you decided everybody should pay so that we can provide for the elderly in their golden years, the funny thing is that their golden years have to start at 55. When most were dead. And the curious thing at the time was that most of these parents had 6 and 7 children. So you had 6 and 7 children paying their pensions for their dad as long as their dad had a above average life in terms of years, because most parents would have died by 50 and they put the pension age by 55. Then came advances in medicine that extended life expectancy. And of course, the system began to have problems in financing because it was already conceived to only provide pensions for the average that survived that were above average life expectancy. To boot, people started having less kids. By now, the system is shot to pieces. It cannot be financed as is. And the only reason why they do it, I would speculate, is because in pensions you have this big pot of money, and when it's full like that, somebody wants to snatch it.